The purpose of education, in my view, no matter what field of education it is to move a person from fear to freedom. And to do so, you subtly bring that individual to willingly take the stand to be responsible for everyone and everything. And that's really the Indian interpretation of Brahmopadesha. It's not new, this is very ancient teaching. Responsibility is not imposed, duty is imposed. When I take responsibility, I empower myself to do something about whatever it is. And if I take the responsibility for everyone and everything, then there is no need for rights. The rights are already assumed. So this is the issue. I think myself that Gandhi actually meant responsibility, not duty. What do you think?
A couple of questions together, or answer each? One that you'd like me to do it?
Answer each, if you
Okay.
don't mind, please.
Superb question, really. It's a superb question because in political discourse, we often don't make a distinction, sometimes we do, between responsibility and duty. Let me put it to you this way, that when one is speaking of rights, the oppositional term in that discourse has been duties, not responsibility, right? Of course, there are particular ways in which one could say that, if I may use the term that the philosopher Wittgenstein used, which is that these bear a family resemblance, right? Responsibility and duty bear some kind of family resemblance to each other. They may be speaking within the same orbit, they may not. Now, in my particular view, we could speak about duties as having more of what I would call a cosmological significance. Okay, that is that when one is thinking about duties, one is also thinking about a kind of conception that developed with a certain kind of moral charge which is very different than the kind of moral charge that one derives when one thinks about responsibility. Okay, so for example, responsibility extends both to the level of the mundane. That I have a responsibility, for example, to myself to take care of my body. Right? Is that a duty or is that a responsibility? It could be seen as both. But the duty always has this cosmological sense, if I may put it this way. Now, one other way to understand it is to look at whether both responsibility and duty have a dialogic conception. What I mean by dialogic conception is whether there is always a conception of the other there. That is, there another party that one is responsible to? So let's say if you're a school teacher, okay, there is always that other. There's always that other because they are the pupils that one has. Right? So the way I would demarcate it, although I'm not entirely certain that it's necessary to do so, is to suggest that responsibility works in the realm of what I would call the everyday, the realm of the mundane. And duty may work in that domain, but it also works in what I'm calling the higher cosmological domain. That's how I would actually make the distinction. But I would, if we had the occasion, because I think your question is extraordinarily important, but I would like to have a clearer understanding of why you think the distinction may be important. And perhaps we can have that discussion later on. Yeah. I thank you for the question.
Professor Lal, thank you for a superb lecture. I have a comment and a question. I'll give you the comment first. I think the concept of citizenship, as you were laying it out, and the tight coupling of duties and rights goes back to Roman times, both of the Republic and the Empire. We could have a separate discussion on that. My question is very different. The word kartavya, which is the traditional word, I think translates as duty. Now, how is it that in a country like India, whose traditional society was based on this concept which you outlined earlier, of rights only flowing from duties, that you've had a complete decoupling of rights from duties after independence?
Okay. So the question is that how is it that in India there was a decoupling? To get to the gist of it, right? How there was a decoupling after independence. My submission to you would be that this started well before independence. It became aggravated post-1947 because now what you had was you had a people who had newly awoken to freedom. Right? And I think that if you typically look at revolutions, you know, I've often made the remark that one of the most interesting things is that revolutionaries do not know how to run a state because they have been accustomed not only to rebellion, they have been accustomed to demanding rights, not to demand duties. Which is why it's important to remember that Gandhi, and I think that this is, if I may put it this way, I think you'll understand the spirit in which I mean it, that this is the least sexy part of his thinking, is that he was extremely insistent on what he called the constructive program. He dedicated the bulk of his life in the 1920s and 1930s to the constructive program. But you know, no one speaks about the constructive program because when you have something like, let's say, the Dandi March, well, that's an event that captivates everyone, right? But what the constructive program is, essentially, is a platform of duties, not rights, right? How do we rebuild a society? So the origins of this problem go to the profound ways in which we were colonized, and to a very great extent, we never decolonized ourselves. You can achieve political freedom, which is why Gandhi's last will and testament, as it's sometimes called, which is the new constitution that he was drafting for the Congress Party, because you know he had recommended that the Congress Party be disbanded. And in this new constitution, he says very clearly, we have gained our political freedom, but we still have to gain our economic, social, cultural freedoms. And in this new constitution, what do you have? What you have is, you have essentially an agenda of duties, not rights. Right? So the answer to the question is that, yes, I agree with what you said about post-47, but I'm also suggesting that this particular problem, so it's a three-pronged answer essentially, that this particular problem originates in fact with our colonization. Number one, it precedes considerably this decoupling, what happened in 1947, and secondly, as I've suggested to you, the work of revolution is almost invariably intertwined with the language and demand for rights. And this is one of the reasons why Gandhi, in fact, actually was quite insistent in coming up with what he called the constructive program, and he devoted the bulk of his life to that. Now, if you look at what happens between, for example, 1925, when he comes out of jail, right? He had been sentenced in 1922 to a 6-year prison sentence, but he came out after 3 years, partly because of poor health and partly because, if I may put it this way, you know, if you display good behavior, and one can't expect that Gandhi would have displayed anything but good behavior, your prison sentence is reduced. So he comes out in 1925, and what does he do between 1925 and the Dandi March? Think of it. Those are the years when he's completely devoted to the constructive program, which the Congress Party and the ruling dispensation completely rejected post-1947. And that constructive program is built entirely around a conception of what are the duties that we owe to the state, to our community, to the nation. You know. Yes? Yes.
I'd like to thank your talk very much inspirational. Now, you have gone to history of 1936, 34, 35, and I'll tell you a story of 1945. My uncle took me to Mahatma Gandhi's tent and introduced me. This is in Patna. People might know Gandhi Maidan. So I went down, I was 8 years old. I went down and touched his feet. He put his hand on my head and then he raised me, he said, put your head up politely. Future is in your hands. Now, why I'm telling this, I have told that to many friends. How do you find the role of the children in the future since then and in the future from now on? What I mean, now I am slightly old, and I think education is the key to what Gandhi was teaching. I like your comment on that.
I'm not sure I have much to say really because I think we all have our thoughts on how we might think about Gandhi's teachings. The difficulties is that sometimes scholars are hobbled by the fact that they sometimes know too much, and when they know a little bit too much, it can be a burden, because it becomes difficult to distill his ideas into the kinds of set of teachings that people would like to have. Right? You know that today, I mean, if we should be candid to ourselves, right, that every constituency in India, the feminists, the Dalits, the liberals, the modernizers, and 15 others, every constituency has some grievances against Mohandas Gandhi. Right? Now, why do they have these grievances? Precisely because there is a complexity. For example, on the question of race. Now, it's been argued that Gandhi was insensitive to the struggle of black people in South Africa. In fact, two very good friends of mine wrote what is now the leading book on the subject. The Stretcher Bearer of Empire, the book is called. But I would also like to remind these friends who wrote that book. You see, the reason I mention this is because it's difficult to extrapolate things so readily from his life unless one really begins to understand the extraordinarily distinct space that he occupied in our moral and political thinking. So these friends, I would also tell them that in 1936, the same year that Reverend Mott came to meet with Gandhi, a delegation of 4 African Americans went to see Gandhi in Varda. Now you can read the text of that discussion in the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi. It's an extraordinary discussion. And what does he say at the end of that? He says to Thurman, who was the leader of that delegation, Howard Thurman, a black theologian, he says, I am quite certain that the next phase in Satyagrah is most likely going to come from your people in North America. I mean, he had an extraordinarily close link with African American thinkers. You know, for most people, the story begins and ends with Martin Luther King. When you immediately say Martin Luther King, no. William W.E.B. Du Bois, the greatest African-American intellectual of his day, in 1920 raised the possibility of what he called an American Negro Gandhi in 1920. And from 1920 through the next 4 decades, he wrote 17 lengthy articles on Gandhi. I can point your attention to 30 of the leading African-American intellectuals, artists, Langston Hughes of the Harlem Renaissance, who all had an extraordinary familiarity with Gandhi. Now you might say, what bearing does it have? What I'm trying to suggest is that he represents an extraordinarily different way of comprehending the world. And we can easily put Nelson Mandela in that lineage that we have invented. But Nelson Mandela, for whom I have deep respect, was also the person who was responsible for having the ANC, the African National Congress, disown its own policy of nonviolence. Nelson Mandela was a founder of the Umkhonto we Sizwe, which is the armed wing of the ANC. And the greatest leader of the ANC at that time was a man called Chief Albert Luthuli, the first African to win the Nobel Prize for Peace. And he was a true follower of the idea of nonviolence. And Nelson Mandela marginalized him. Right? So these histories are extraordinarily complicated. But you know that in the popular domain, of course, Nelson Mandela is part of that great lineage which goes from Gandhi and then King and then down to him. And similarly, when I think about, what should I be telling my students and how do we convey the teachings of Gandhi, I think the first and ultimate thing, because this is the cardinal Gandhian thing. We don't really talk about it. We talk about ahimsa. It is actually satya, truth. It is this particular quest for truth which is the bedrock of Gandhian thinking. Why did he go from the formula God is truth to the formula truth is God? Because he understood that that was the most inclusive way of trying to be able to bring within the orbit of a humanistic way of thinking everyone, including those who are atheists. One of the most remarkable little books which I recommend very strongly for those of you who have any interest in this matter is a book by Gora, who was an atheist. And the book is called An Atheist with Gandhi, where he talks about what he learned from Gandhi, who was a devout Hindu. Right? So if I had to take one thing, one teaching, it would have to be that we have to be really resolved to try to understand what he understood by truth and what are the implications of this, particularly in this, in our times. Mr. Swarup, a few days ago, day before yesterday, had mentioned this in his remarks, and I myself had adverted to this actually in an earlier lecture just a few days before that the Oxford English Dictionary in 2016 picked as its word of the year post-truth. Post-truth. I mean, what are the implications of the idea that we live in a post-truth? That seems to be as devastating as a nuclear attack, from my point of view, if we really pursue the implications of what that means. Right? So that would be my response.